Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Hondorp, Director of Choral Activities at Western Kentucky University. We've been asked to give an introduction to this year's All-State piece, which I'll do with the help from some of my colleagues here at WKU. We're going to walk through just a little bit about the composer and poet and the placement of this piece in the composer's life. We'll go through some suggestions on how to approach teaching the piece. We'll speak through the German clearly and accurately, and finally give you some suggestions for interpretation. Let's get to it. Austrian composer Anton Bruckner was born in 1824 in a little town just outside of Linz, which is west of Vienna by a couple hours, and died in 1896. His father was an organist and a church musician, and Anton followed suit, becoming extremely talented at both organ in prepared work and improvisation. As choral conductors, we know Bruckner primarily for two things: his Latin motets for the Catholic Church — he was a devout Catholic throughout his life — and his mass settings for choir and orchestra, or choir and wind ensemble. In 1861, at the time of this piece's composition, Bruckner was living in Linz and working as a church organist, and had just completed composition studies in formal structures, including canon and fugue, looking mostly at the music of Mendelssohn and, by connection, Bach. Bruckner's teacher had not allowed him to compose his own music during this time, so this light-hearted part song must have been a breath of fresh air for him. He had just been appointed director of a Liedertafel, which is an amateur singing group that got together to make music and to socialize. These groups, as well as the larger choral societies, flourished in this period of time. The poet, Heinrich Heine, was German-born and lived in the earlier part of the 19th century. His poetry is known for its lyricism and often featured the prominent themes of love and nature, as this poem does. Many of the poems were set for solo voice by the great composers of German Lieder. As a matter of fact, if you did a Google search for this particular title without putting the composer in, most likely the first hit would be Schumann's setting of the same text for solo voice.
Hi, I'm Lauren Whittam, the Associate Director of Choral Activities at Western Kentucky University, and it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you about this year's all-state audition piece, Du bist wie eine Blume by Bruckner. After allowing your students to listen to a quality recording of the piece and mark their scores accordingly, I'd encourage you to begin introducing the piece in measure 23. I think from 23 to the end, your students will have the most success in the shortest amount of time, and it'll give them a nice overview of the piece. Starting in measure 23, we begin on an F major chord, and the piece is in the key of F major. I would encourage you to have your students start by looking at the bass line. The first interval in the bass is an F down to a C sharp, which will look like a fourth to your students on the page, but it's a diminished fourth, so it's going to sound like a major third. So just from that first outset, I'd encourage you to have all of your students practice singing the interval from Do down to C, and then the entire bass line on solfege from measures 23 to the end. Immediately begin adding the phrase shape that you'd like. Encourage your students to breathe and mark their scores on the rests in measures 26 and 28, and to sing the solfege with the appropriate phrasing and breaths. Still singing the bass line in unison on solfege, ensure that your students aren't punching or clipping the ends of phrases. For example, in measure 26, the downbeat of that phrase is an unstressed syllable. It's likely that it will sound too loud because it falls on a strong beat. The basses are approaching it by leap, and it's in unison with both the sopranos and the altos, so that pitch should be treated with particular care. Once the choir can sing the bass line expressively, have everyone count the alto rhythm in measure 26. Using the Eastman system, it would sound like this: 1, 2, ta, 3, 4. Ask your tenors to find that same rhythmic figure in their part on the same page and have all the students write in the counts. Then I would encourage you to have the basses and tenors sing the bass line on solfege and have the sopranos and altos together read the alto line. Ensure that they're still paying attention to phrase length and shape and the breath marks that you put in place earlier. Notice that between these two parts, the altos and the basses are in unison octaves frequently throughout the section. Teaching these two parts first will help aid your students in tuning. I would encourage them to listen and tune those octaves perfectly. Next, I would add the tenor line. Basses sing bass on solfege, altos sing alto on solfege, tenors and sopranos will sing this tenor line together in whatever octave is comfortable. Notice the dissonances between the tenors and the basses. For example, bass and tenor are a tritone apart in measures 23 on beats 3 and 4, and just a second apart in measure 27 on beat 3. These dissonant moments may make it difficult for your tenors to find their correct solfege syllable and may result in students unknowingly singing the nearest consonant pitch. Help them hear and lean into the dissonances. Might also be helpful to ask your students to mark those dissonances in their music using a colored pencil with a bright color like orange. Finally, I would add the sopranos to their own part and allow all 4 parts to sing on solfege. Watch for balance issues immediately. For example, there's a crescendo in measure 24, and the sopranos have a high F marked forte at the end of measure 24. Because the other 3 voices sit so low in their range, and there's more than an octave between the alto and the soprano pitch, it's likely that this high F will stick out of the texture. It's important that sopranos float their tone in that place, avoid the use of too much vibrato, and listen carefully to the other parts for tuning. Using an open I vowel will help the sopranos in that location as well. Once the students feel comfortable with measures 23 through the end and it's solid on solfege, other rehearsal techniques may include singing on a neutral syllable like do or do. This intermediate step may help bridge the gap for your students between singing solfege and singing the German text. Another great rehearsal technique that I enjoy using with my students is to have them sing all the pitches on a staccato syllable, bum, so they sound like a marimba choir. This ensures that they're moving together rhythmically, and it also creates a situation where the students aren't able to listen and then slide into the pitch after they hear it. It will reveal a lot to you about your students' intonation, their confidence, and their rhythmic integrity throughout the section. You may also want to vary the tempo as you rehearse to keep things interesting and to keep your students engaged. The tempo at the beginning is marked nicht zu langsam, which means not too slow. So I would make sure that it doesn't become too slow and drug out, especially during the reading phases. Finally, I would discuss text and translation with the students. Have them write the word-for-word translation into their score, read the text poetically outside of the rhythm, begin speaking the text line by line in rhythm, and then finally add the text to the pitch. After learning the end, measures 23 through 31, in an artistic and expressive way, I would go back to the beginning of the piece and teach the remaining sections using similar teaching techniques. I think it makes sense to divide this piece into rehearsal sections by lines of German text. So for example, the first rehearsal section will be just measures 1 through 6, rehearsal section 2, measures 6 through 12, rehearsal section 3, measures 12 through 18, rehearsal section 4, measures 18 through 22, and then finally rehearsal section 5, what we've already learned, measures 23 to the end. Keep in mind, the middle sections of this piece will present the greatest challenge, both harmonically and rhythmically, especially when the voices are paired in duet, soprano and alto, against the tenor and bass. General things to look out for throughout the piece will be dissonances between the voices, especially at the interval of a tritone, moments where the voices are in octaves and making sure that the students are tuning those octaves perfectly, ends of phrases, especially when an unstressed syllable falls on a strong beat, 1 or 3, or if it's approached by leap. Intonation at cadences. Generally at the cadences, I ask my students to sing with a steady tone to help those moments tune really pristinely. Once the notes and rhythms and text are all underway, encourage your students to study the dramatic elements of the piece, the climate and the mood. Ask them to develop a clear, concise, and consistent communication of the piece. Write in descriptive words that help remind your students of the affect of the piece and whenever it changes. Use words that elicit emotion, like bold, hushed, intense, transparent, smooth, distant, weighty, celebratory, gentle, bitter, weary, or buoyant. And then encourage your students to conduct themselves freely from a 4 pattern to show the shape of each phrase. It's important to spend time teaching students to consider all these elements of the music and to teach them how to diligently mark their score so that when you return to rehearsal the following day, they retain all of the information that you've provided for them. This takes a lot of time, but it will build a clear oral concept of the piece that's technically solid and grounded in thoughtful decision making. Thanks for your time.
Hi, I'm Dr. Liza Kelly, professor of voice and co-chair of the Department of Music at Western Kentucky University. I'm going to help you with your German diction for your KMEA vocal audition on Du bist wie eine Blume by Anton Bruckner. So what I'm going to do is I'll read short phrases and take a pause in between so you can pause your video and repeat what I say. Here we go. Du bist wie eine Blume, so hold und schön und rein. Ich schau dich an, und Wehmut schleicht mir ins Herz hinein. Mir ist, als ob ich die Hände aufs Haupt dir legen sollt, betend, dass Gott dich erhalte, so rein und schön und hold. Now, some tips about enunciating your German diction. Take each of your phrases and keep your breath going through the consonant sounds, almost as if each phrase is one big run-on word. For instance, du bist wie eine Blume. There aren't any pauses in between the words. The breath keeps going between bist and wie. Bist wie. Another tip is on your ich laut, which can be difficult. This happens on words like dich and ich. So to help you with that enunciation, allow the tongue to form in the E vowel position. You'll feel a little lift on the front end of the tongue to form the vowel E. E. Now, as you hold the tongue in the E position, allow the breath to travel over the tongue. E. You can feel the breath move over the tongue, versus if you pronounce the ich laut as a sh. Good luck.
Just like you wouldn't read poetry without any inflection, let's make sure that our students don't sing these lines without any sense of rise and fall, so that the music doesn't come out sounding static, but rather has some energy and vitality. As an example, let's look at the very first line sung by the altos without any sense of rise and fall, which I hear very regularly. It's a little uninteresting. Du bist wie eine Blume, du bist wie eine Blume. Versus paying attention to the rise and fall that's written into the phrases. For instance, in this first phrase, going directly to the syllable blu of Blume. Du bist wie eine Blume. So that there's some shape and interest in that. Alongside the phrasing, commas in the text in general are going to require decisions on your part as to whether to breathe or not breathe in those particular spots. If you do choose to breathe, be sure that there is a clear ending of one thought and beginning of another, so that it really sounds musically like sentences being spoken rather than just note to note. Let's look again at this first line with the altos, now with a comma between the repetition of the text. Du bist wie eine Blume, du bist wie eine Blume. So that again, there's a rise and fall inside each of those phrases with a comma in the middle. Take a look at what's happening in measure 4, where the soprano, alto, and tenor have a comma, but the basses are singing a different text and don't have a comma. This is a decision point for you as the teacher with several options. You could have the soprano, alto, and tenor breathe with the comma as it's written and have the bass sing through the line. Or you could ask them, to sopranos and altos and tenors, to sing through the line with the basses and ignore the comma altogether. Or you could ask the basses to lift at the same point, though there's no comma in the text, making the attack on the word zo clear between all 4 parts. And these kinds of decisions are there all the way through the score for you to make for your singers. Make sure that you've marked them really completely and coach them through those sections. This piece from the Romantic era has a full range of dynamics written into the score. Pianissimo in measure 10 all the way to a full forte. Follow these markings as you are able, but make sure you're doing it within the beauty of your own instrument. Never sing louder than beautiful. There's a suggested metronome marking of quarter note equals 90 at the beginning of this piece, but that said, please don't let the music end up feeling absolutely metronomic. Don't be afraid to take a little time for expressive purposes and push and pull a little with your students. Let's take a look at a couple of examples for this. Find measure 21 in your piece going into measure 22. And if you look in the score, this is a really clear dominant 7th chord, this C7 chord, heading back to F major. Formal moments like this can be made more special by taking just a little bit more time. Consider coaching your students to ease into the cadence and the downbeat of measure 22, and then breathe together and start the next phrase musically and organically without feeling metronomically tied to the beat of 90. Just a bit later in the music, take a look at measure 26 and 28. In the bigger picture of the poetry, Heine ended the first line of text at the beginning of the piece with the adjectives so hold und schön und rein. But at the end of the poem, to match the rhyme scheme, he writes so rein und schön und hold. And Bruckner made sure to make the music special at this point. In the alto part in measure 26, the altos sing by themselves, so don't rush through that metronomically. Take a little bit of time and set it off by the commas. And in measure 28, it's the same story for the tenors. Don't rush through. Take just a little bit of time. As you coach your students in quartets, obviously this needs to be worked out in advance and rehearsed carefully, but the end result is going to be much better for musical expression. If you're interested in seeing some interpretive markings, reach out to me and I'm happy to share my own marked score, but know that those choices are not authoritative. They're my choices, as they should be for you. That said, I'm happy to share them with you if you're interested. We hope this has been helpful for you. If any part of this is unclear or if you'd like some more information or clarity, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. Good luck to you and all of your students.